Yeah, so there's two massive derbies this weekend, which is interesting. Probably the biggest derbies
What
in
do you,
world football, apart from Barcelona
Barcelona and Real?
and maybe the Manchester City clubs. But
So I think the interesting thing about the football this weekend is to do with what happens when you're playing in a derby match that doesn't happen when you're playing in a different kind of match. So we've got Liverpool versus Everton, and we've got Spurs versus Arsenal. So why is it that derbies lead to different outcomes? They lead to different kinds of games compared to just a standard football match.
yeah, I think firstly you're right. If you look at the Spurs versus Arsenal history, they're always very exciting games. I'm probably going to say that, and it's going to be a drab.
Is that because you're a Spurs fan?
But they are always exciting, and I am a Spurs fan, and Spurs usually win.
Is that right?
No, I completely just made that up. But in my head, they usually win. No, I think they are going to win tomorrow. But yeah, Spurs, Arsenal, North London derbies, always a lot of goals, always a lot of tension, and that's the reason behind that is all about identity, I guess, and the big out group versus in group, and that rivalry that they have. It's all about group process and group psychology. So, as an expert in group process and an expert in group psychology, Jay, lead the way. What's going on inside a player's mind when they lunge in for a 2-footed tackle and get red carded in a North London derby?
Yeah, so I imagine what's happening in the player's mind is that the importance of this match is much greater, which means that they're going to be overstimulated, or at least the risk is they become overstimulated, too competitive, and they start to make mistakes, particularly start to make mistakes once they go behind. So that sort of over-anxious panic kind of mode sets in. So the question for a coach has to be, how do you prepare for that? And I guess what I'd say is I don't think you can prepare for that in the week beforehand. I think the preparation for that starts before the season even begins. I think that when you're working with a group of players, you need to think about the moments of truth that are going to happen for that team. So when are going to be the highest, most tense moments, the highest stress for that team, where performance is going to come absolutely to the forefront, and how can you, in your preparation around people's beliefs and understanding of the team, will guide them when they get to those situations. What you want is for the habitual response for a player when they're under that kind of pressure, when they're in that kind of cauldron, to be one which is consistent with the sort of response they'd show during the rest of the season. So some clarity around how they're going to play the game in that circumstance.
So in many ways, it's not the strength of their connection, strength of their connection to the group, which is often what we're dealing with, especially in organizational circumstances, is to really try and get people to believe in what the group stands for. But in many ways, when it comes to derby, they're already very motivated. They're already almost too emotional, and it's a question of reframing what that group does under pressure situations. In those pressure situations, are those people reflecting and being mindful of how of their actions, or are they letting the redness set in and emotions take over?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because what we're normally doing when we go and work with teams is we're trying to increase the extent to which they identify with the team, so that in a business it's very often the case that the teams within businesses have very little identity. There's very little clarity about why should I categorize myself as belonging to this group, and what does that even mean. It's not psychologically important to people, and so when it's not psychologically important, their behavior is driven by their own individual needs, or the needs of the subgroups that they belong to, perhaps friends and cliques, and so you get politics and so on. But in the situation for a sports team that moves into a derby situation, I imagine that as the week progresses, that sense of identification with the group becomes stronger and stronger, really intense. We know that people identify more strongly with groups at times of external threat, and we know that having a clear outgroup, an enemy, an opponent that you care about comparing yourself to, makes belonging to the team more salient to people. So it's just bringing it right to the front of their mind. Christ, this is what's going on at the moment. So in those situations, I think that the difficulty is where that identity is kind of emergent, and it's not emergent around performance. So what happens if we're thrown together in a group and there is an external threat to us, then we start to behave collaboratively with the people around us. But that's not necessarily the kind of behavior that leads to high performance on a football pitch. And we do, we have seen, we've worked with teams over the years, haven't we, where although they've had reasonably strong identities, those identities haven't contributed to performance because they've not been thought through. They've sort of emerged in a bit of a random way rather than being planned and have a strategy behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. And what role do you think the fans have to play when it comes to big derbies?
Probably depends on what their view of the team is at the time. I imagine that if you're a fan of a team like Spurs at the moment, where the fans are probably not only happy with the results that are coming, but also happy with the style of play and the kind of excitement and the attacking style of football that they're seeing, then if it starts to go right for you, the pressure from the fans will actually help you. I think if you're playing a different style of football to the fans' expectations and things start to go against you, then I imagine that the pressure would become really intense in the opposite direction and they can become a burden on you. I suppose you think about Manchester United at the moment as a team that potentially experiences that kind of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Jose Mourinho versus Pep debate is certainly very interesting, and maybe that's one for the next episode.
Yeah, that could be. Okay. Well, that's it for this very short episode on derbies in football. We didn't know we were going to be talking about derbies in football until we started talking about derbies in football. Maybe this is how these things will just emerge. Thanks very much for listening.